The Great Moral Paradox, the abolition of the slave trade in Britain in the shadow of a £20 million debt. The history of the British Empire's abolition of the slave trade and the subsequent emancipation of enslaved people stands as one of the most compelling and morally complex chapters in Western history. It is a story less about sudden enlightenment and more about a protracted, dramatic political war, where a rising tide of popular conscience collided with the unassailable fortress of global capital. The triumph of abolition in 1807 and 1833 was secured, but at the cost of profound hypocrisy, geopolitical opportunism, and a colossal financial debt whose shadow stretched across 2 centuries. The sinews of empire, anatomy of the slave economy. The industrial scale of inhumanity. By the late 18th century, the transatlantic slave trade, TAST, was not merely a lucrative sideline, it was an industrial system, forming the deep financial scaffolding of the British Empire. This forced mass migration, which transported an estimated 1.5 to 1.9 million enslaved Africans under the British flag between 1700 and 1807, fueled the hyper-profitable plantation economies of the Caribbean. The entire system relied on a sophisticated financial apparatus headquartered in London. Western port cities grew rich on this misery. By the 1790s, Liverpool ships alone controlled 80% of the British slave trade and over 40% of the entire European trade, surpassing historic ports like Bristol. The prosperity of inland cities was inextricably tied to slave-grown goods. In Bristol, thousands of white workers were employed in industries like sugar refining, chocolate manufacturing, and tobacco processing, all dependent on imported Caribbean raw materials. The fight for abolition was thus a direct attack on a deeply entrenched, geographically diverse economic oligarchy determined to protect its profit margins. The problem on the doorstep. The issue of slavery was not confined to distant colonial sugar fields. By the 1780s, roughly 15,000 black people, both free and enslaved, lived in England and Wales, primarily in domestic service in London and the major port towns. This physical presence transformed the abstract moral dilemma into a tangible daily reality. The case of Somerset versus Stuart in 1772 provided the first legal crack in the system, with the court ruling that slavery was unsupported by the common law of England itself. While not emancipating colonial slaves, this legal footing provided a crucial initial platform for the emerging anti-slavery movement. 2. The Forensic Campaign. Architects of the Moral Revolt, the Quaker Conscience, and the Parliamentary Proxy. The moral offensive against the TAST was initiated not in Westminster, but within the radical nonconformist movement of the Quakers, Society of Friends. They were the first major religious group to collectively condemn and formally forbid slave ownership among their members. Recognizing their political limitations, as nonconformists, Quakers were legally excluded from seats in Parliament. They founded the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade in 1787. 9 of the 12 founders were Quakers. To gain political purchase, they needed an Anglican parliamentary spokesman. This pivotal role was assumed by William Wilberforce, a deeply religious member of Parliament who declared his lifelong mission: God Almighty has set before me 2 great objects, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners. Thomas Clarkson, the data architect. The movement's parliamentary success depended on generating undeniable facts. This was the singular mission of Thomas Clarkson, the movement's forensic investigator, who essentially pioneered the field of human rights journalism. Clarkson traveled over 35,000 miles across Britain, interviewing more than 20,000 sailors, meticulously documenting the horrifying cruelty aboard the slave ships and the high mortality rates of the British crews themselves. To convince a skeptical public, Clarkson developed the campaign chest, an ingenious piece of visual evidence. This chest contained physical objects, torture devices, iron shackles, and critically examples of West African textiles and goods. By displaying evidence of sophisticated horizontal loom weaving from Africa alongside instruments of torture, Clarkson simultaneously proved the inherent cruelty of the trade and refuted the racist arguments that Africans were incapable of civilized, legitimate commerce, thus providing both the moral and the economic rationale for fair trade. 3. Democratizing dissent, the power of narrative and consumption. Equiano's testimony. The narrative weapon. The most powerful weapon to shift public opinion was the direct, eloquent testimony of the formerly enslaved. In 1789, the autobiography, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa, the African, became a genuine bestseller, running through 9 British editions by 1794. Equiano, who survived the Middle Passage and bought his own freedom, appealed directly to the empathy of the British reader, asking, "Is it not enough that we are torn from our country and friends? Why are parents to lose their children, brothers their sisters, or husbands their wives?" He provided shocking anecdotal evidence, like the incident where sailors, rather than giving starving captives leftover fish, tossed the catch back into the sea. Crucially, Equiano was also a pragmatist. In the final chapters of his narrative, he presented a powerful economic case, arguing that ending the TAST was a universal good that would open an endless field of commerce with Africa, boosting British manufactures and commerce far more effectively than the brutal, limited slave trade. The Consumer Revolution, the Sugar Boycott. In 1791, abolitionists launched an unprecedented political tactic, the mass consumer boycott of slave-grown West Indian sugar. Activists, known as anti-Saccharites, deemed sugar consumption inherently immoral. This movement was a masterstroke of political democratization, as it allowed individuals traditionally excluded from formal politics, especially women and children who managed domestic purchases, to exert direct influence on state policy. Women became the primary distributors of anti-slavery information, wearing pendants inscribed with the plea, "Am I not a sister and a woman?" While free labor sugar from India appeared on the market, albeit more expensive, the widespread refusal of slave-produced sugar created immense moral pressure on Parliament, proving that public will could translate into measurable economic action. Fourth, the 1807 Act, the paradox of principle and pragmatism, geopolitics and moral high ground. After 18 years of relentless parliamentary defeats, the Slave Trade Act was passed on March 25, 1807, prohibiting the transportation of slaves within the British Empire, effective May 1st. This victory was secured not solely by moral purity, but by geopolitical expediency. With Britain locked in a global war against France, the government recognized a crucial strategic advantage. Napoleon had reintroduced slavery in the French colonies in 1802. By passing the act, Britain gained immense moral superiority, allowing London to prosecute an ethical crusade abroad, while simultaneously facing military defeats closer to home. The timing ensured that morality and imperial pragmatism were perfectly aligned. Debunking the decline myth, econicide. The long-held historical argument, popularized by Eric Williams, suggested that abolition was an act of economic self-interest because the slave economy was declining. However, later, seminal research by Seymour Drescher countered this view with the term econicide. Drescher argued convincingly that the slave trade remained profitable in 1807, meaning Parliament actually enacted an act of economic sacrifice by yielding to overwhelming popular moral pressure. This perspective is supported by the fact that after 1807, Britain became ironically more dependent on slave-grown cotton from the United States. In 1803, only 8% of imported cotton was non-slave produced, to fuel its booming textile factories. This shift proves that the abolition of the TAST was a moral and political decision, not an act of economic convenience. V. The heavy weight of the shackle, the aftermath, the unfinished war, and institutional hypocrisy. The 1807 Act was only the first chapter. It banned the trade, but slavery remained legal in the colonies for another 26 years until the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. To enforce the law, the Royal Navy launched the West Africa Squadron, described as the most expensive international humanitarian intervention in modern history. Between 1807 and 1860, the squadron heroically seized 1,600 ships and liberated approximately 150,000 Africans. Yet, the cost was immense. Roughly 1,600 British sailors died, primarily from tropical diseases. Despite the Navy's sacrifice, the illegal trade flourished, often funded by British capital. Slave traders evaded the law by sailing under Spanish or Portuguese flags, and British credit and shipyards continued to finance vessels transporting millions of Africans to slave markets in Brazil and Spanish Cuba after 1808. This profound institutional hypocrisy demonstrates that while the state adopted a moral stance, the financial sector cynically continued to profit from global slavery, the debt of historical injustice. The final triumph, the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, freed over 800,000 enslaved people, but only after Parliament agreed to a monstrous compromise, compensating the slave owners for the loss of their property. The compensation totaled an astronomical £20 million, equivalent to 40% of the UK's annual national budget. This money was distributed to about 3,000 slave-owning families, whose fortunes helped fund art collections, estates, and future generations of the British elite. The liberated received nothing. This act of profound historical injustice was financed by a massive government loan, the interest and principal of which were paid by British taxpayers until the debt was finally retired in 2015. Thus, freedom was secured at the cost of recognizing ownership of human beings, transferring the financial burden onto generations of taxpayers for 182 years. 6. Conclusion: the long shadow of compromise. The Act of 1807 remains an extraordinary testament to the power of moral conviction and grassroots activism. It successfully challenged a foundational component of the British economic structure. However, the legacy is one of profound ambiguity. The victory was intertwined with geopolitical gamesmanship and followed by institutional hypocrisy, as British capital seamlessly shifted to financing slavery abroad. Most damningly, the freedom granted in 1833 was predicated on a compensation scheme that solidified the wealth of the oppressors and burdened the British public until the modern era. The story of abolition is not a simple arc from darkness to light, but a dramatic struggle where moral principles fought capital, and the ultimate victory was stained by the cost of compromise, the weight of which continues to shape contemporary conversations about justice and reparation. The final legal abolition of all forms of slavery in the furthest reaches of the empire, such as Nigeria and Bahrain, did not even occur until 1937. The true cost of conscience was, and remains, immense. The story of abolition is far more complex than the simple moral victory we often remember. The Slave Trade Act of 1807 was an earthquake, a triumph of public conscience over the entrenched economic oligarchy that had funded the British Empire for generations. It proved that activists like William Wilberforce, backed by mass movements like the sugar boycott, could force Parliament to sacrifice profit for principle. But the final act of freedom in 1833 came with a staggering, cynical price. The government chose to compensate the oppressors. Parliament paid a colossal £20 million, 40% of the national budget, directly to the 3,000 slave-owning families, while the newly freed received nothing. Here is the most profound and shocking truth of this legacy. The massive loan taken out to fund the compensation was a burden placed on British taxpayers that was only finally paid off in the year 2015. The debt incurred to reward those who owned human property lasted for 182 years. That is the long, morally ambiguous shadow of this historic victory. We've seen the bitter compromise. The state chose financial recognition of human ownership to achieve peaceful emancipation. Now, I want to know where you stand. If you were William Wilberforce in 1833, facing the choice between paying the 20 million pounds to the enslavers to ensure a peaceful abolition or risking an immediate, potentially violent emancipation without compromise, which path ensures true justice? Let me know your stance on this great moral paradox in the comments below. If this deep dive into the true, complex cost of conscience changed how you view British history, then smash that like button. Your support helps us challenge the historical myths and reveal the uncomfortable truths that truly shaped our world. And for more stories that bring history to dramatic life, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell. Thanks for joining us, and I'll see you next time, right here on the Edge of History.